And are we ready to go? Right, and then I'll be here, I'll set the slides going. So you're going to speak first.
I will speak first.
Yeah, okay.
You guys are in the, when you have to meet your computers. When it joins, just so we don't get feedback.
There we go.
Yeah.
It's now started, and that's good.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Before we get started, maybe I can just make sure we're getting some response online from folks. So you can hear us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, we have confirmation. Yeah.
Fantastic. Sure, I feel like I'm driving blind a little bit. So, yeah, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. I'm sure it's been an extremely busy week for everyone, with term wrapping up and exams finishing. For those of you who joined us, thank you very much for joining us. Before I introduce the speaker for today, and I would like to invite to the podium Elder Darlene McIntosh to provide us with a welcome to the territory.
Howdy.
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 We have such a big crowd here that I have to get them. Wow, so it's like there's 100 people here, but we have the most important people here.
32. 32.
So we are welcoming 30 people online.
Mother Earth is really in charge and we're just bystanders. We think we're in charge, but we know better. So in saying that, we are on the traditional lands of Claytley Tene Nation. And Claytley is a carrier word where what it means is that the confluence with the joining together of the two rivers, the Nachaca and the Fraser River. And Tene is of the people. So we have been on our lands for eons, many, many years, and we are now welcoming the colonialistic aspect of the institution here to bring and share really positive news that Margot will be sharing with us. So in saying that, I want you all to take a nice deep breath within your body. Nice deep cleansing breath. As we breathe into our body, we connect to ourselves at a deeper level. And we never remember how important breath is until it's taken away from us. The day you were born, you took your first breath of life. coming on this earth plane, and to be able to share everything that you have, all your gifts you're sharing with everybody else here. And we connect a little bit differently now, virtual rather than in person. And hopefully with the days coming and going that we are able to connect physically again, because that disconnection does nobody any good. So as we breathe into our body, we pull that breath all the way down into our feet. And then we're standing outside today in Prince George. It's a beautiful sunny but cold day. We're standing outside and we take that deep breath all the way down into our feet. And we feel our feet sink into the deep, rich soil of Mother Earth. And there she grounds us into today, into this very moment, to be present of what will be taking place, rather than being in yesterday or what do I have to do tomorrow. Let's all come together to create a oneness, collaborate and share, but to pay attention to what's going on and to question things that you're not sure of, rather than just letting them slide. We'll be in the moment, connected together, collaborating and sharing. So in saying that, we, the Clayton Tenay Nation, have been on our traditional lands over 9,000 years, is supported by living evidence. The changes that have taken place over thousands of years supports the enduring strength, courage, and fortitude of our peoples. Our governance through the Batlas brought balance and harmony with our brothers and sisters of other First Nations people. Clayton Tenay's clans are Frog, Lasilu, Grouse, Utsut, Beaver, Sa, and Bear Sus. Through this system, we know who our family connections are. Through our oral history, the use of legends told of our travels, our hunting and fishing territories, our trading practices with all peoples. May you remember and hold steadfast in what Creator's blessed us with, and that is our traditional territories. Our ancestors have always welcomed people to our territories. On behalf of Clayton Tenay's elders, our youth, community members, and chief and council, it is absolutely our honor to welcome each and every one of you to our traditional territories. All my relations, Nachaca, Masi. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Merci. I will make it.
Thank you, Darlene, for that wonderful welcome. And it really is nice to take that moment and just take that deep breath before we start this conversation today with Dr. Parkes. And thank you so much for the welcome to the territory. My name is Sarah Gray, and I am one of the members of the steering committee for the HRI. I've also been involved with Dr. Margot Parkes as well as Dr. Peltier in organizing the seminar series since it started several years ago. The seminar series was started as an opportunity for health researchers across, not only across UNBC, but also with our partners to share health research from a variety of disciplines with each other so we could be better connected and form collaborations, or even just an understanding what each of us are doing and working on. And these are some of the contributors and sponsors of that seminar series who have supported us for all of this time. So the School of Health Sciences, Nursing and Social Work, as well as the Northern Medical Program, the Psychology Program, and funds from Sun Life Financial. And I just wanted to make sure, sometimes we breeze over some of these contributors, but I thought we do want to remember that this is a partnership and these people are making it happen for us. I'd also just like to thank Leanna Garraway for all of the work that she does behind the scenes to coordinate all activities that go on by the HRI. This is Deanna's contact information, and so we just put it up here. Just if you have any questions about the speaker series, if you're interested in being a speaker in the HRI series, or if you have any questions at all about the work of the HRI, please reach out to Leanna. She'd be very happy to hear from you. So today, it's actually a really great privilege for me to introduce Dr. Margot Parkes. Margot and I have been on the HRI steering committee for many years now together, and I mentioned we've been two of the faculty member involved in developing this seminar series. And also Margot has just recently taken on the co-lead for the HRI. And so I feel like it's a real treat for us today to hear about her work. And I just love her title, and it's just paired so nicely with Darlene's introduction, Healthy Confluences and River Conversations from Eco-Social Approaches to Public Health from Oceana to Canada. I'm now gonna before I do an introduction for Dr. Parkes and tell you a little bit about Dr. Parkes' background, I just want to remind everyone that our next seminar series presentation will be by Dr. Margot Greenwood, and that is on the same schedule as our normal schedule, which will be on January 20th. We also have a winter welcome event occurring on January 11th. What the heck is the HRI and why should I care? So if there's anyone out there that's new to the HRI, doesn't really understand what the HRI is or whether that they could be a member, please come. And the answer is yes, you can be a member, but please come and join us at that session. Okay, so I now will just provide a brief introduction for Dr. Parkes. Dr. Parkes has lived, learned, and worked across Oceania, Europe, and the Americas. In 2009, she came to UNBC as a Canada Research Chair in Health, Ecosystems, and Society. She is a professor in the UNB School of Health Sciences, cross-appointed in the Northern Medical Program, and is also an honorary professor at the University of Otago. I hope I've pronounced that correctly. Sorry, in New Zealand. Her research focuses on integrative, partnered, and Indigenous formed approaches that connect social and ecological influences on health within watersheds in rural, remote, and Indigenous communities. She has led a variety of networks, including the ECHO network here at UNBC, which focuses on cumulative health, equity, ecological challenges of resource extraction and climate change, and is also the co-lead for several Canadian organizations around ecosystems, health, and education. And as I mentioned previously, she has just become the co-lead for UNBC's HRI. So with that, I'd like to welcome Margot to the stage and to start her presentation.
So I'm very, very happy to be here today. We understand that at the moment, probably your good fortune, some of you are not seeing the speaker. So we are going to just fiddle around with those things in the background here. And we're also going to see if we can correct it. We're seeing it fine on all of our computers here. So there seems to be something occurring when you share the screen that I need to adjust. Okay. Let's see, we've got the same issue that we had last time. So we'll just deal with these happy little technical issues here. And yeah, so folks, some people can see now, they can see now when I'm not, that's excellent, when I'm not sharing my screen. So you get me or the slides. But the slides have got so many fantastic images. So I'll just try once more and we'll see if we can, how's that looking? So we need to figure out how to turn off that HRI.
And I'm not getting the option to remove it. So
I see.
Apologize.
And did we try to get Dustin back?
He's coming.
Okay, that's great. Well, I think we'll just start. You've seen me briefly. I'll just stop sharing and take a moment. I'm going to take off my mask and I'm going to offer a really warm welcome to you all. I particularly want to thank Elder McIntosh for making the time to come and to welcome us here. Today's topic and the themes of today are deeply relevant to Lheidli territory, and it's always an honour to both work with Elder McIntosh, but also to have her present in the room. Thank you, Sarah, for your introduction. And thank you all for being here. We've got a small gathering here, but it is really nice thought for me that there's people coming in from different parts of the world. And we're going to save the chat box after the session. And so if I can make sure that Leanna and Katie will save that. So I'll get a better sense of who's in the room when the chat box comes. So it's also really important for me that this moment is really a conversation. We're about to enter into we're about to arrive on the winter solstice here, the summer solstice in New Zealand. Wherever you are in the planet, it's a good time to slow down and to listen to stories, to listen to each other, and to connect with things that are important. And so that is really the essence of today's talk, is a moment for me in some ways to offer a presentation that is one large acknowledgement of the many things that have influenced my work. As some of my colleagues know, we had a cancellation for this session, so I had to decide, am I ready to do this? And I thought, yes, I can do this, so long as we can have a conversation together at this important time of year. So it is a reflective moment. And in fact, the images that you're going to see on the slides are just, they're important. And so I am going to share my screen, and we may get somebody in shortly who can help us get to be able to see the screen and my face at the same time. So I suggest Alex. Doesn't seem to. It's really interesting. We can all see me on the screen, but it seems that you can't. It seems that the HRI is the main video. That's what the issue is. So we may resolve that in the background. But I'm going to begin. And I'm going to begin importantly with a slide that is going to reflect many of the themes that we're influencing. Can you see it now?
Yeah.
Oh, amazing. Look at that. Alex. Thanks, Alex. Alex is, that is a beautiful expression of, in fact, what I'm about to share about today, which is that me standing here is not me standing here alone. Not only is there Alex and Katie and Leanna, Sarah, Elder McIntosh, and the colleagues that have joined us today and that joined online, but everything that we're doing is in many ways a coming together of things. And so that is really one of the main themes today. And so that coming together of things, the confluence theme, we're going to be exploring in a number of different ways. And so I am also going to take a moment to offer a different kind of welcome. And that welcome is to say kia ora tātou, ko maukatua te maunga, ko taere te awa, no taere mouth ahau, ko Parkes toko whānau, ko Margot toko ingoa. So what I've just offered is, it's called a pepeha. Those kia ora to those joining from Aotearoa. I think there are a couple. And it is a way of orienting ourselves. And in many ways, it's a form of acknowledgement. And on the left-hand side of the screen here, you're going to start to see images of the Tari River. And the Tari is the river that's referred, ko taere te awa. Tari is the river. Tari is the river that has definitely grounded me for most of my life. And I am very fortunate, though, to have moved into different parts of the world where I've got to know other rivers. And since 2009, I have had the great fortune of getting to know the Nachaca River. And in the top right of the screen, you'll see an image and a confluence indeed. The image above there is the confluence of the Nachaca and the Stewart River upstream of where we sit here, but a very important confluence for anybody at UNBC and anybody working and living in Prince George is the confluence of the Nachaca and the Cletaco being the Fraser. And so you're going to hear about those connections, but it's deeply important for this talk because this is the territory on which I've had the great good fortune to learn, to live, to explore, to grieve, to discover over the last 12 years since I arrived here in 2009. And so one day I thought to myself as I shared this pepeha, which is in Māori, maybe one day I'll know enough Dacalth to be able to make a similar kind of greeting. But it is very important for me to acknowledge the rivers and the lands in which I'm here today. So another element in this talk is, in fact, at the bottom of the screen here, you'll see a reference to a paper that I just had published that came from during my sabbatical. And it was a challenge for me. Is it possible for me to try to tell the story of a conversation between these two rivers, the Nachaca and the Tari? And so I'm going to attempt to do that today, and I'm going to do it in a way that brings together many points of connections of work and interactions. There are many, many individuals to thank. In this paper, I thank the people on the screen, but there are so many others. And many of those in particular colleagues, Māori colleagues who I've particularly worked with in the context of waterways and land water systems. Elder McIntosh is referred to, Elder Albert Marshall from Mi'kmaq territory, on the east coast of Canada, on the other side of Turtle Island, is acknowledged, but there are many others who I've worked and learned with over this time. I also acknowledge my parents and my partner, Hamida Razak, because of the ways in which over time and with family, with friends, many of you will be acknowledged indirectly during this talk. You might not see your name, but you'll recognize, oh, we've talked about that. Oh, I remember that time. And so I really want you, when I'm talking and sharing things, to know that I am cross-referencing those other conversations. And the idea here is that elders are not just people. Elders are the land and the places that enable us to be. They are our precursors. They are the things that enable us to be healthy. So I stand here as somebody who trained and worked as a medical doctor, but has, as many of you know, gone upstream into the landscapes and the places and territories, the lands, the waters, the airs, the places that enable us to be as human beings amidst our relations, all our relations, but also to find our paths to be healthy. And so I'm going to offer a story. This is about there are very few numbers in this talk, but here are a few. So I'm going to be referring to two rivers. You've already started to meet them. To three processes. I'm going to be talking about influence, about confluence, and about emergence. And I'm going to be sharing some frameworks that have evolved. And really the lesson here is that there are cycles of learning over several decades that I'm going to give a glimpse at. And just a glimpse, I'm not telling the whole story, but it is a real honor to be able to attempt to draw and show the threads of connections. I'm also going to finish off with a story about all our relations in the form of different species, that in ways that was a wonderful discovery for me during my sabbatical and when I was writing the paper I referred to. I was discovering ways which even the creatures around us helped me connect this home here in Kleitleitene territory with the connections down the Fraser to the Pacific, across the Pacific, and to the Tari. And you're going to hear about that conversation, both in terms of people and species. Another way of thinking about how to do this is in this little image. And I'm going to be talking about the who, the where, the how, and the what in that same kind of way. And I'm going to be telling the story with images, most of which are my own, but some of them are shared by other people. And also with a jumble of ideas and frameworks that you'll come back to and I'll talk through as we work through. And this is sometimes how it feels in my brain. So I'm going to these kind of jumbles, but it is also important that there are patterns. And I really ask you to look for those patterns as you are hearing this particular story. So here we have an opportunity to introduce you to two rivers. Maps are one way in which we can get to know a place, but they're only a glimpse. And so here we have on the left-hand side, the Tari. And the Tari River is a particular river in the east coast of the southeast of the South Island of New Zealand. And you can see that there is a little map of the South Island of New Zealand in the top of here where my cursor is. And so here's the Tari, and Tari Mouth is a place that I've had the good fortune to be returning to my entire life because of the multiple generations, particularly on my mother's side of the family, that have been returning to that place, mostly as holidaymakers, but sometimes living there. And so there's multiple generations that have returned, as I do, to the mouth of the Tari River that flows into the Pacific. And it's notable to me when we start our introduction to the Nachaca River that it also drains into the Pacific. It initially flows away from the ocean, as does the Tari. The Tari, first of all, flows in a strange manner. It flows north and away from the ocean, and then it eventually comes around in terms of its progress. It comes through these different plains and out to the coast. And the Nachaca is also one that is influenced deeply by the Kenny Dam that was placed there in the 1950s and has completely changed the flows of this entire system and everything downstream since then. But the Nachaca is also joined, as you saw in that previous confluence, by a very large system draining into the Stewart River, draining into the Nachaca. And the combination of the Nachaca flows out to Prince George, to the Clatako, to the Fraser River. And that is the territories that we are in as we stand today. And so once it joins the Fraser, it travels all the way down to the Pacific Ocean. So both rivers start by turning the way away from the ocean, but there is something inevitable about rivers. They will somehow find themselves to the salt water. And so I put this little other version of the Tari at the side here to actually give you a sense of scale. The Tari is very small. I tried to match the scale. So the Nachaca is an epic system, and it's only part of the Fraser system, and it drains an area 1.5 times the size of Vancouver Island, for those of you that know geographies. And you can see that the Tari, if we actually put it in there, it's actually quite small in comparison. But we're going to talk about some of the ways in which there are some other similarities. So here's just some more information. I'm not going to talk about it in great detail, but the Tari is small, as I said, in comparison, 5,650 kilometers squared compared to 47,200 kilometers squared, almost the size of Switzerland for people that need kind of other geographic references. But they're both a large proportion of what surrounds them. So the Nachaca is 20% of the Fraser system and 5% of all of British Columbia. But Tari it's a big chunk of land for New Zealand. The Tari is 288 kilometers long, the 4th longest river in New Zealand. And because of its long route, it's not a particularly well-known river in New Zealand in many ways. Most rivers in New Zealand flow directly from some mountain system to the ocean, and the Tari takes a very unusual route, which also means it's a very low volume river and a different kind of river than many people think of as the epic braided rivers of this, particularly of the South Island of New Zealand. And the Nachaca itself, the main stem of the Nachaca is about 500 kilometers long, but it picks up and it is joined by all these other rivers that drain a very large part of territory, particularly in the Dakelth-speaking territories of the Indigenous peoples of this region. And it's important, I'm now in the bottom right, to acknowledge that there are 15, under the Indian Act, if we think about First Nations across the Dakelth and the Carrier peoples, there's 15 nations, First Nations, that are named in this area. But most of those are connected as people that speak one Dakelth dialect or another, or a part, overall, largely part of the Carrier Sekani communities. And so in the Tari, now in the bottom left, Kaitahu is one of the largest tribes by area in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and is in this area there are several family groupings. Runanga is the word that you see there, that harvest, that collect, that relate to different parts of the Tari. So these are places that have long been peopled before the colonizing influences arrived and added another layer of change in these spaces. So I'm going to dig in a little bit more with the Tari just before we start moving into some of the themes that they bring us. And in that regard, I'm just going to do this so I can see the time there. In that regard, where here you start to see some other images, and you'll continue to see images of these systems as I go through the talk. But one of the features of the Tari that is really always quite evocative for me are these extraordinary scroll planes up in the top. And one of the things that you might be thinking, I thought I was coming to a health presentation. I haven't heard any health or any disease for a long time. Am I in the right session? But I want you to keep thinking about where the health and well-being connections are of these kinds of themes. And so up in the top, we're starting to see what I'd like you to look for those of you that have a medical or a health orientation. I want you to start seeing the patterns of the ways in which nature works in ways that are so similar to our bodies. And so these scroll planes, these areas where the flow is very slow, things take up a different shape and a form. I've heard some colleagues say these are the varicose veins of the top of the Tari. But the point is that we're seeing ways in which these very unique features that form. And so this is a very rich biodiversity area of the Tari system, and that is very vulnerable because of some of the changes that are happening in nearby landscapes. So those are the scroll planes. The cows on the bottom are a reminder that as we move in through these alluvial plains of the very rich, fertile plains of the Tari, and as we come down into a very flat area by the coast, there's a lot of dairy intensification. And like any areas where there has been intensification of agriculture, riparian access is a challenge. And now we start, you might think, aha, there's a health hook. There's bugs in those poos. So that's true. There are a really important consideration in terms of water quality that we need to start to think about. But it's not the only issue. Quantity, quality, drought, floods, climate change, they're all alive and well in these places and impacting on people in different ways. In the top right here, you see the bottom gorge of the Tari River, the final gorge. I've walked this river gorge probably more times than any other part of the planet. So I'm very fond of these images. And at the bottom here is the coast. And you can see the Tari Island. One of the jokes I often made is that I did my PhD research in this system, which is one of the reasons why I'm so obsessed with it. And as you come to the end of this question mark shape of the river, you get to the coast and there is an island on the coast. And for me, when I was doing my PhD research, that island was the point of my question mark. And when I finally realized that I'd arrived at the point, a lot of things became clearer. And the reason these things are important is that these are they're long histories of change over time as people have populated those fertile plains. Animals and other species have also been part of those plains, and these changing systems all tell a story that influences both the social, the economic, and the ecological influences on health and well-being. So here is the Nachaca, this system, and I've chosen just a couple of images. There's so many I could have, but one of the things that I love about the Nachaca is it's got a very hard story to tell in a lot of ways. The impact of the Kenny Dam created a profound impact particularly for the people of the Cheslada Carrier Nation, but all the way downstream, which does tell a story of grief and loss and colonial impact that I still find heartbreaking. And it is still unfolding, but in very, very meaningful ways. One of the roles that I've taken on over the last 5 years within the Nachaca is with the Nachaca Watershed Roundtable. And the Nachaca Watershed Roundtable is one of the places where people from various parts of environment and health sectors are interacting to progress this kind of work. And the Nachaca system is still bearing the impact of the Kenny Dam, not only for the Cheslada people, but for particularly the Nachaca First Nations downstream from the dam, the Stella 10, the Nadlawa 10, the Sykas, and also Claytlay Tene. And everywhere downstream is also being impacted by the upstream impacts of that dam, in ways that is actually also inspiring some very exciting new partnerships in the Nachaca. So as current co-chair of the Nachaca Watershed Roundtable, I've been really inspired to see the new kinds of partnerships that are starting to emerge between local government and First Nations. And again, we're hearing stories of what it is that makes the influencing the social and the ecological elements that influence the health and well-being of the communities that we're working in. So you've met two rivers now, and I'm going to now swing through some other interactions. Is things okay?
Do you have your power cord on you?
Do I have my power cord on me? Yes, I do.
Okay, you might want to plug in.
Okay, is it telling you that it's going to run out?
It is.
That's great. See, the team is in action again. Thank you very much. So another perfect example of the need to think about the influences, the confluences, and the emergence that this talk is going to touch on. So here I'm going to take a moment to introduce each of these ideas and how they have also influenced my work as somebody who began as a medical doctor, began as a kid in New Zealand with interests in health and environment, progressed to become a medical doctor, and has spent the last several decades exploring these kinds of connections. So one of the words I'm going to begin with, and that is really a process. We're talking about processes of influence on how our thinking, and any of us, has a story like this. How you began is influenced by many things over time. And I want to say thank you to Lindsay Galway, who alerted me to this quote by Robert Macfarlane, of the way that influence is also a watery word, that it actually does remind us of the ways in which things are flowing in. And I find this a very important way of understanding knowledge. So as somebody who stands here, to my surprise, a professor at the University of Northern British Columbia, I'm really aware of the things and the influences that have flowed in over time, the people, the knowledges, the disciplines, the experiences. And those are patterns that we all do well to pay attention to and to be respectful of. And so one of the sets of, if you've started to see some of the patterns in my work, I've mentioned the word ecology many times. And I moved from somebody who studied and worked as medicine to do a master's in human ecology. And my master's in human ecology was a really wonderful crash course for me in ecological thinking. And it expanded my horizons on ways to think about not just the human system, not just this body, but the family systems that we are amidst, and then embedded in the ecosystems on which we depend. And that ecological, that systems way of thinking has deeply influenced why over the last 15 years or so in particular, but almost 20 years of being quite closely linked with a body of thought that is sometimes put under the umbrella of eco-health. I often will phrase that in relation to ecosystem approaches to health, but here are just a few of the broader communities that I have been actively involved in. And for those of you that are listening and who have been part of those communities, I thank you. I thank you for all the ways that our conversations and these communities have created a space for us to explore these kinds of connections. They're all in evolution, some of them international, some of them based in Canada. As you can see here, Cope Canada, the Canadian Community of Practice and Ecosystem Approaches to Health, EcoSante, which is a Latin American, Caribbean, and Canadian collaboration that has been deeply informative for me, and a new iteration of EcoHealth International efforts. So that's just one set of influence. And I am not in any way trying to capture them all, but they have influenced the way that as somebody who started in health, I have found homes in places that are making these connections. These days, if I was a medical student, I may well trip into the new field of planetary health. And I can come back to that in the discussion. But this is in the last few decades, these are things that have been really influencing me. And here I'd like to make a deep acknowledgement to the work of Valerie Brown, who as an elder, as an influencer of my thinking from my PhD days, is one of the people that I think championed how we think about this collective learning process. And in this little table, what I've tried to do is to point out that there are some very familiar patterns and cycles of understanding that can be understood as connected, even if the language is different. So on the left-hand side is Val Brown's framing of what she refers to as a collective learning cycle. these questions, these important questions of moving through, of understanding what should be, what are we aspiring to what is, where are we at now with our understanding of something, to what could be, which is what is our dreams of where we could go, to the pragmatic realities of what can be. And that these are variations of an adult learning cycle that are also patterns that we can see in all sorts of other ways of thinking. I happen to train in the clinical method, and in many ways, I see these ways of thinking as very interlinked. And in a chapter in this particular book called Working Together for Whole Systems, I outline how across this whole table, there are very similar patterns of cycles of learning that are important for us all to do. And in many ways, any kind of research is doing some similar things. But what I've particularly attended to here are fields where research is just one phase of the thinking, and that it's an influence in how we're understanding particular parts of the system, but there's a whole lot of learning and engagement that needs to happen in conjunction with it. So I could speak for hours just about this slide, and for people that are interested, they might want to follow it up in that book. So we get this, I've explored this idea of influence, but there's a very particular thing that occurs with this idea of confluence, not just because we're living at the confluence of the Lake means the people of the confluence of these two rivers, but that this is what I was trying to do in this paper, was to explore a conversation in the way that is in the spirit of a junction of two rivers. How can we actually bring up and lift out to see the patterns across these kinds of spaces? And so I'll just touch for a moment on this idea that rivers, speaking of this idea of flows of knowledge, one of the patterns I've always been very interested in is the way in which when two rivers meet, particularly two rivers like the Nachaca and the Fraser, one of those rivers loses its name. And that's not dissimilar to other things that join together. Happens in marriages in some contexts. One of the sides loses its name. Does that mean it's any less important? No. Why is it that the Fraser gets to keep the name? Well, there are very clear limnological reasons why that occurs, and there's a very clear criteria for when two rivers meet, which river gets to keep the name, and it's to do with the length and the amount of orders of stream that are influencing that river. So how many subsystems are joining in a river will determine who gets to carry the name. So sort of how many connections that river has made. But in fact, when the Nachaca and the Upper Fraser meet, the Nachaca is the bigger watershed. It drains a larger area. So it might not have as many sub-tributaries because it hasn't come from the Rocky Mountains in the same dramatic landscape. But when it joins, it's draining a larger area. But it's the Fraser that keeps its name. And it's the Fraser that is the famous salmon-bearing river, the largest salmon-bearing river in the world, that is so well known to so many. But in fact, the Nachaca is a hidden story of that river system. It's one of the largest tributaries and is often forgotten. So one of the themes I'm trying to highlight here is that when things meet, pay attention to that which is lost. Just because something carries the name does not mean that we shouldn't pay attention to that. And that's particularly important when we're thinking about different forms of knowledge. And you've already heard me making reference to the importance of Indigenous knowledges. That's just one example of how we may name something one thing, but we need to find ways to contribute to what's in our learning. Those of you that have moved across disciplines may have a similar pattern where you've moved across a discipline, you've maybe moved from one to another. Which discipline do you keep? If you started your degree in health sciences and then you move over into ecological territories, which name do you keep, or the other way around, and why? And how do you talk about the influences on your own academic journey? So those are all themes that I find deeply interesting when it comes to rivers. And so I'm now also coming to this idea of emergence. And emergence is very much a systems concept. It's one that many of you will be familiar with, but it's so important for my work because in many ways, it is at the core of what my work, sometimes called research, sometimes called practice, is trying to create. It's trying to create opportunities for the system, the ways in which the parts of a system influence one another, expressing consequences and leading to outcomes that would not otherwise have occurred if the components hadn't been interacting. This is captured by the phrase, the whole is more than the sum of its parts. And it's a really important idea that is, again, in this diagram that you are seeing, the two-eyed seeing diagram here, I think is really important when we're thinking about other forms of knowledge interacting with each other. How the whole can become more than the sum of its parts as compared to one needing to win or to be the dominant. And so this image, many of you have seen images about two-eyed seeing. This was a concept that was developed by Elder Albert Marshall that I referred to earlier, a Mi'kmaq elder from Cape Breton in Nova Scotia and Mi'kmaq territories, and has been deeply influential in a lot of thinking in these spaces. And for me, the posture here is extremely important. How are we listening so that these two things, or perhaps more than two things, can come together in a way where there is meaningful exchange? And it's not easy to do. It's something that we have to work at, and it is something that I am still definitely working at. And here we could spend a long time on this slide, but I've had the great good fortune of working both with Elder Marshall, and I'm going to come back to some of the other quotes in here, but this is derived from a project that some of us were working on that I'll refer to later, that was bringing together an emphasis on co-benefits. And I'm going to just flag two of the quotes here. One of them is from the East, from Elder Albert Marshall, where he says, "The kneeling figures are a gentle reminder that from this vulnerable position, you cannot be seen as a threat, and rather as a humble servant, learning from other perspectives, overcoming the notion that humans are superior, seeing we are all intimately connected, and honoring the sacredness of the world, our home." And it's a very powerful message about how we can commence to do this work that is the bringing together of things. The two-eyed seeing sometimes feels frustrating to people because it sort of feels either or. And I particularly value this quote from my colleague, Helen Moaka Barnes, Professor Helen Moaka Barnes, an inspiring Māori scholar that I've had the great good fortune of working with for over a decade and a half. And Helen says, in Māori, the third eye is matakite, visions of the future and deep insights, a place of dreaming and transformation. Arriving at the third space, we have to transform ourselves, bringing together all ways of seeing to create a third space of transformation. This is a wake-up call where dreaming turns to action, underpinned by Indigenous and non-Indigenous ways of seeing and working. So that idea that the two-eyed seeing enters the third space or opens the third eye is very evocative to me. And the other quotes here are, we started from the East, from the North, from a Dene scholar, Nicole Redvers, who's an incredible champion of bringing Indigenous knowledges into the planetary health space at the moment. I mentioned my colleague, Helen Moaka Barnes, and a very inspiring colleague, Anne Paulina, who's from the Kimberley regions of Western Australia, who really underscores the role of rivers as home places where we can explore these kinds of connections. And so now I'm just going to take us, I hope you've sort of entered into a space where you're thinking, well, I'm glad I don't have to talk about health and disease right now. But what I'm going to do is to show you a couple of frameworks, which are attempts to bring some of these ideas to bear on frameworks and ways of thinking. So this particular framework was based from my PhD and has been iterated but with many colleagues over many years. And for those of you that are listening, I thank you for those iterations. But it is right at the core of the way that I have originally started to think about the impacts on health and well-being. So you've heard a fair amount about ecosystems, and I'm also underscoring here social systems and the processes that drive equity or inequity, the issues of fairness and justice that also are a very important driver for my work. And at the top, there's this idea of what are the drivers of change in the system that we're thinking about, and how do these things combine to influence on health and well-being? So when you do land those driving forces in a social ecological system, instead of a town, for example, or a house or or a country, and you're really thinking about socio-ecological systems together, you can start to see the patterns and the pathways of influence that can affect health and well-being. So a lot of my work has landed in the watershed space. And another way of thinking about these same ideas is in this diagram that was bringing the idea of a cascade of influences. And some of you may have seen this before. This is particularly influenced by my landing here in northern British Columbia and thinking about the ways in which there are multiple influences on any landscape that are then creating this cascade of impacts, where an ecological impact becomes a social impact, becomes a health impact, becomes an ecological impact, becomes a social impact. We're talking about direct effects, direct impacts as a consequence of effects, of direct impacts, of long-term indirect downstream impacts. We're talking about change interacting over time in ways that are unpredictable, uncertain, and complex, but that we need to pay attention to. And so on the top of this, you can see climate change coming down, which could be the entire focus of my conversation. Notice I did mention climate change earlier. And for many people, the assumption is if you're interested in environment and health, your gig will be climate change and health, because that's the only kid in town. But one of the things that I really try to emphasize is that climate change is just an amplifier, an overlayer of all of these other things that are already existing. So we need to do better in all of our work to be able to try to understand some of these overlapping impacts. And so that's been part of the work of over the last 5 years with the Environment Community Health Observatory Network that I've had the great good fortune of being the lead researcher along with my colleagues from Simon Fraser University, from Alberta, currently in Lethbridge, from Lakehead University, from the University of Moncton, and all across the country and the world, an amazing collection of colleagues. And again, I thank you, all of you, you know who you are, for being part of that team, because we haven't got it figured out, but we are all working together to try to pay attention to these complex issues. And where that's leading us, I think, is really important. So here's the Eco Network in its early infancy, just to reinforce the influence of the Nachaca River. You can see there our large team at our launch meeting. We had people from all over the country, and we're standing by the Nachaca River in Sycus territory in Vanderhoof. And it really was a memorable time. Most of our work has landed in different cases in northern British Columbia in partnership with the First Nations Health Authority, in the Tidal River Watershed, and with the New Brunswick Environmental Network. But that's not the only places the work has unfolded, and we've had emerging cases and connections with Oceania as well. And so the important idea here is that all of these ideas are an evolution. So even though speaking of those cycles that I referred to earlier, that one of the ways that's emerged from that work is that we can focus on the cumulative impacts. You started to feel that heavy weight of the cascade of one thing leading to another thing, leading to another thing. And one of the things that's really emerged from our work as an eco network is that it's important to balance that also with an idea of designing for co-benefits, that we're not just talking about impacts and the negative pathways, but it is possible for us to focus on what is it that works that can be co-beneficial for people, places, and planet, and how do we understand what makes those things work and do more of that. And that is part of our challenge, because as researchers, we are generally trained to study what's not working. And when we shift our attention to figure out what is working, and I actually just caught the eye of my colleague Sarah there, and when we're doing foundational and biomedical and clinical research has a good tradition of trying to figure out what works and do more of it. And sometimes when we're looking at basic physiological and other pathways, we're also figuring out, what are the things that we need to figure out how to amplify those things that are causing, not going to harm the system. And yet when we move up into our complex social spaces, we often forget that it is possible for us to identify things that are working and try to do more of those. And it's not necessarily been the way that we operate. And so increasingly, and again, there's a large group of people that were involved with developing this framework for some work we were doing together that's focusing on amplifying co-benefits. And here, we're talking about some underlying commitments that need to inform the work. And you won't be surprised, they're words you've already heard, which is that in order to do this work in this time, it's really important for us to be honouring Indigenous knowledge and prioritising Indigenous knowledges in ways that has not been achieved in the past decades of the ways in which we've operated. And we've got a long way to do to prioritise those knowledges, not just tokenistically include, but to really learn humbly with and alongside and in conjunction with. And to be championing equity, not thinking about, oh, now we're talking about environmental issues, we'll forget about all those social inequity issues. That time is past. We can't just focus on environmental issues without focusing on equity issues. And we can't focus on equity issues without paying attention to the living systems that we depend on. And so here's our challenge. How can we bring all those commitments together and be thinking about designing in ways that could actually create these kinds of synergies? So this is a very aspirational framework. It's a framework that has manifested in the work that Elder McIntosh was talking about earlier, our land health and healing work, our work with the National Collaborating Centre on Indigenous Health, profiling healthy land, healthy people, but also an intersectoral action in terms of inland water systems and watersheds and wetlands, and in particularly for many of my colleagues for whom climate change is one of the main foci of the work, how can we start to imagine that work? These streams of work are just one example of how we can manifest this sort of thinking. There are many other ways, just transitions, thinking about a healthy green transition post-pandemic. I like the way I trip over that language. But in this time of the pandemic, how can we imagine not just focusing on health and isolation from our social and ecological responsibilities? So I've been playing recently with some colleagues of, how do we capture this in its essence? And we've been particularly liking this framing of a healthy laws, land, air, water system. What would it mean to have healthy laws that reflect those kinds of elements? And as I say that, I feel in my body, because I've been living in these territories, the really deep, unjust struggles that are occurring in territories so close to us. And I could have spent my entire talk speaking of those injustices, but where I find, and in most of my conversations with colleagues, there are spaces for us to acknowledge those injustices. I'm thinking particularly of the grievances that are occurring on Wet'suwet'en territory right now, and in many other territories where there are compounding past, present, and potentially future harms. That what would happen if we started imagining new ways to work together that are not compounding those harms and are working together for co-benefits? And so as I swing through to my wind up here, I'd really like to underscore that there are many places where this sort of work is coming to life. And as I mentioned earlier, this is all teamwork. And I haven't even mentioned all the teams that influence my thinking, but there is teams such as the Canadian Community of Practice, and we run an annual field school where we encourage people to engage in this kind of thinking. And I just was looking at one of the students who's still smiling about having survived the field school, and we're still working together. So I guess that's probably a good thing. But there's also groups that such as the Ecological Determinants Group on Education that some of you have also been part of, and that is still figuring out. Tenacity is the name of the game here, because these issues do not get a lot of traction in our institutions because they have been considered slightly fringe. And the way that I like to think of these things is if we put all the fringes together, I often refer this as my daisy metaphor, but if this sort of integrative thinking is at the fringe of where the dominant thing is, and if you put all those fringes together and you put them at the center of the daisy, there's quite a lot of overlap. There is a lot of people that if we can find ways to build those collective efforts, we've got more chance to do this work in a meaningful way together. And so one of the projects that's one of the closest to my heart at the moment, literally and figuratively, is the Co-Learning in Our Watersheds project. This is a really inspiring partnership with School District 91, which happens to be a school district that overlaps almost entirely with the Nachaca watershed. And so that's actually larger than the Nachaca watershed, but has those same 15 First Nations, inspiring leadership from Leona Prince, the principal of Aboriginal Education, Manu Madoc, the superintendent, but an amazing team of teachers and champions who are we're trying to figure out how to transform education by connecting students, communities, and their waterways. You'll notice again, health's not mentioned. Is this a health project? Well, for some people it isn't. There's no diseases. I don't see any stethoscopes. I don't see anybody. But in fact, this is a way for us to understand health in a health promoting way. And underscored there, sort of an acronym soup, is the IUPE GWG. That stands for the International Union on Health Promotion and Education Global Working Group on Why Order Planetary Health. And so this is the field of health promotion expanding its way of understanding to embrace these kinds of bigger picture thinking. And many of you, there may even be some people on the call that are part of that working group and that thinking. So an idea here that I'm just going to touch on really quickly is this idea that there are ways in which and I think this is really important for me as a professor, but for those of us that are engaged in this work, we can't just study it. We need to figure out how to strengthen capacity for it. And so that's why those groups such as the Canadian Community of Practice and these other groups, this is building capacity for the next generations of people to do this work. So we learn about how to do this work and then we go out and we do it and then we come back and teach it. So this is this sort of cycle of learning about the content, figuring out how to teach it, and that enabling us to figure out how to do it and then to learn and then to teach it. So these cycles of education and practice that does require us to be thinking about working with schools, working with universities, working across universities, working with other partnerships. And again, there are many other partnerships that could be mentioned here. A final thing that I'm really wanting to underscore is, and in some ways, it's a late time in a talk to mention this, but there are very important issues that need to be considered around equity and injustice in this work that I do just want to land on for a moment. And I find Nixon's coin model of privilege and allyship really powerful, which is to remind us that it is in some ways a flip of a coin where we ended up in terms of privilege or oppression in our worlds. And that when we align ourselves on one side of that coin or the other, we're actually not really deeply understanding how much we all need to be we're all part of the same system, and that there is an obligation for all of us to find in ways that make sense for us, steps to be tackling this. And one of the ways in which I practice this is to be working really hard in this both and thinking. And I'm again going to acknowledge Val Brown, who continues to influence my thinking in this regard, when it is that we recognize the tendency to think about one thing or the other and to not think about both. And so all of these different communities are thinking about addressing both and cumulative impacts and co-benefits. We can hold those two things in our imagination at the same time. We can think about resource development and climate change. We can't just think about one or the other, and we can't have programs for one or the other because they're totally overlapping. That there's ecosystems and equity. Gone are the times when we're talking about one thing or another in relation to the impacts on health. We need to find ways to do that together, and that also relates to privilege and oppression. And so in the sort of conglomeration of groupings here, I mentioned here the Integrated Watershed Research Group, and that's a group that I've worked with in the Nachaca over the last decade. It's been really helpful for me learning with some fabulous hydroclimatologists and sediment and limnologists about how we can bring these different themes together and be talking about both and as colleagues, as well as how we're thinking about these systems that we're learning in. So I'm coming to the end of these themes, and I'm going to leave you with one other, what I think is a very powerful invocation: the confluence, the convergence, this idea of the weaving of networks. And here, what you see on the bottom, on the right-hand side here, is an image from the beach at Tari Mouth, where I invoked, and you can see Tari Island, that point in the question mark in the distance. And I'm going to lean into that island in a moment as I wrap up the talk. But in this sort of coming together of things, I also find it really helpful to see patterns in Indigenous languages that help us think about things in ways that are different the way than English forges those patterns. And so in the work of, from a really beautiful book called Tiwai Waka, Healing the Maori of the Whenua, there is this idea of that rangaranga is a word that one of its meanings is to weave in Maori, and that a rangatira or chief is somebody can be conceived of as somebody who weaves, and that leadership can be involved in weaving the people together so that they can work together in a united and coordinated way to achieve their common goal. It's not about power and authority, it's about humility and courage. Humility enables us to see that if we're to meet the challenges of our time, we need to work together. And courage is what is needed to take the lead in bringing people together to achieve that. And these are the kinds of integrating momentum that are often missed in academic work, and which I'm really thankful that in my work, I get to work with other colleagues who are seeking to do that weaving, to bring things back into a whole, to the coming together of things is so often what we fail to do and which we can do better. And so I'm going to lift up and out to this, to invoke the Tari and the Nachaca again. And so you'll recognize those maps on the left-hand side. And I'm just going to walk you through a journey. So this was a lovely piece of work I did when I was at Tari Mouth, thinking a lot, Zooming every day with people on Great Lakes territory. But I was on the left-hand side here in an image is that we're imagining a journey that spans rivers, oceans, species, flyways, and hemispheres, creating a conversation between these rivers that connects whitebait with bald eagles in Canada. And I'm going to take you on that journey, but I'm going to set the left-hand side image here is actually the flight paths of a particular bird that you're about to hear about. And on the right-hand side of the image, I showed this to somebody recently. They said, I hope that's not a flight path, but it's actually a map of collaborative connections among people that are working across Canada and Oceania on these kind of work. And it's those kinds of connection that I'm really seeking to fuel with my current roles from UNBC and connected at the University of Otago. So I'm just going to read this because it is a way to just sort of capture your imagination. So the starting point is the Tari River. A native inanga or whitebait has spent 3 to 6 months in the coastal marine waters after hatching and is returning to the river. He's a little fledgling small fish. The juvenile inanga avoids the human nets being used to catch the whitebait. My mother might be carrying one of them at the Tari Mouth, and swims upstream to mature in the Waipori wetland, where it is eaten by a large mature tuna. And a tuna is a long-finned eel. So this galaxid species has found a resting place in the Waipori wetland and then is eaten by a tuna. The tuna comes back out the river and comes towards the coast, and it is feeding on the mature galactid. It's ready to spawn, and so it begins its journey downstream from the upper Tari scroll plains to the mouth of the Tari River and out into the Pacific Ocean, beginning a long journey north and east to spawning grounds in the subtropical Pacific. So the tuna itself does this epic thousands of kilometers journey to go and spawn. But I'm not actually going to follow the tuna. I'm going to pick up with the tuna swimming out through the Tari Mouth estuary. And it swims past Motorata Island, the island that I invoked, that full stop, and a near shore breeding colony of the seabird titi, the sooty shearwater. In late April, at the end of the southern breeding season, the titi makes a deep dive to catch a squid. And then the tuna and the titi pass. They pass each other underwater, each on their own way to warmer habitats. The titi surfaces, readying to commence its own journey, a migration across the Pacific Ocean, journeying along a flyway that leads to the Pacific Northwest. And so discovering that the titi, the sooty shearwater, comes all the way up to the northwest and arrives in the Strait of Juan de Fuca. So it does the same trip that we do in our flights, but I think I made a typo there. But it reaches the western reaches of the Salish Sea in May. So moving from the winter to come north, it's coming north to feed, and the titi overwinters here. And what I've invoked here is that as it dives to feed on fish in the summer, the titi passes different types of salmon, returning to the Fraser River after 3 or 4 years in the Pacific Ocean. And among these are the Chinook salmon. There are many that come this way, but the Chinook is beginning its 1,000-kilometer journey up to spawn in the Nachaca River. And the Chinook enter the Fraser River at the river delta near Vancouver and pass through the coastal mountains in the Fraser Canyon and work 800 kilometers upstream to the confluence of the Nachaca and the Fraser. And this is a species that doesn't follow the Fraser up to the headwaters, but goes to the Nachaca because that's where it came from. And so this particular salmon comes, it lands on, it finishes its journey, it comes to spawn, and where its carcass will be eaten by eagles, resulting in the ocean nutrients fertilizing the riparian species nearby. So this is the same story that means that there is genetic material in the top of cedar trees in northern BC, the genetic material from salmon in the cedar trees. So suddenly we see that whether we like it or not, these species are reminding us of our deep connections. And that although my life has been very, very blessed to be able to do this in large metal birds, there are other species that are taking similar treks, and that we need to, it behooves us to learn from them and with them. And so I'm winding up our conversation with that invocation. You've heard about all our relations, you've heard about two rivers and their connections, you've heard about these processes of influence, confluence, and emergence, you've heard about frameworks, and you've landed back in all our relations. And I really want to I want to invoke and remind that there's a lot of groups that have enabled these kinds of connections to be made. Some of them are funders, some of them are partnerships. I haven't put all of the logos here, that would take a long time. But it is really important for me to acknowledge that there's all sorts of ideas and references, and to land here with encouraging you all to think about, for you, this just happens to be my version of this, but I would argue that you've all got a version of who, where, how, and what that's important for your learning, and that I am really pleased to have had the opportunity today to share some of my reflections, some of my acknowledgements of those influences, to say a big thank you to all those that I've named and have not named, but have invoked through these conversations, and to conclude with the openness to questions, to conversations, and to a chance to lean ourselves into, I hope, a restorative break full of stories and good connections. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Margot. That was amazing. I think we'll leave you here at the front, because I'm hoping that we can sort of initiate this discussion. Can I help facilitate?
Yeah,
I
I guess so. I mean, I think we can, I think the main, it's nice to have you up here, Sarah. I think the main message is that, oh, look, I've got a Christmas tree over my shoulder. That's kind of cute. So that's a good theme. We will shortly break for Christmas snacks. But yeah, we'd be happy to have, there's a few people here. We'd be happy to hear from anyone online. Any random questions, comments, teasings, otherwise, from people that know me from here far and near, or any questions from those of you that are here. I'd welcome any reflections, comments, anything.
If it's okay, I might just start with my own reflection.
Yes.
I have to tell you that your story, just the way that you think in such a holistic way, is incredibly inspiring. Not only like about health, like human health, ecological health, community health, but also just the way that you are, and these groups of individuals that are out here today are sort of learning how to collaborate and think in this large scale way, an integrative way, is impressive to me. I know for me, so many times throughout your talk, I'm thinking about what you said about, I think all of us have experienced or witnessed what happens when we get exceptional pressures in our systems, this year with things like the pandemic and other natural disasters. And I think it really highlights the need for this kind of thinking. But as you said, it's always existed. But anyway, I just want to tell you that I really appreciate that there are so many of you out there that are brave enough to think in this way. And I say brave because for me, it really is a brave thing to be able to do, and to generate this knowledge to teach the next generation to think about these ideas in such an integrative way. So thank you. Yeah, I
Well,
really
thank
appreciate
you.
it. I really appreciate your perspective. So I don't know if we have any questions or stories or just comments or discussions that people would like to bring forward. We have one in the room. Maybe I
Great.
can start there.
So, like from beginning, I was able to connect myself with your journey, like where, when, and how. So, at the end, I was able to connect myself in my present situation where I'm working for the wellness of people with dementia, where we are developing resources, so I can connect inequality and like resource development and then improving the wellness. So all the concepts that were around the coin, I was able to connect that the current situation. So here I was thinking that all is connected to our wellness. Overall, like global world as a community. I can see that way to this all of the journey. It's from one corner of the world to the other. And I'm just thinking about less privileged people in developing world. How could I support them back home to my country? I think there are some of the areas which need improvement to improve the quality of life of people. So I can connect myself with this presentation. It is really inspirational.
Well, those are really nice comments. Julia's asked to repeat. It was more a comment than a question, but I'll just kind of paraphrase. And to some degree, it relates to what Sarah was saying, which is that it is possible, despite our constraints, it is possible to see these connections in our work. And so we were hearing about connections with work with dementia and recognizing all of these overlays from resource development and climate change and issues of both sides of the coin and that it is a moment when we can see the connections that we sometimes block out. And I think that one of the things that I observe, and I appreciate, Sarah, you mentioning courage, but I think that curiosity is and sort of willingness to learn as part of it, is that we've been it's been taught out of us. And my experience is that as human beings, we're far more capable of doing this thinking than we think we are. And I was asked once, well, how can I do this in my research? Like my research is this little piece, and I just have to focus on this little piece. And one of the things, I don't know who I can attribute this lesson to, but that idea within when we're dealing with complex things, to make sure that we tell the story in some way, in a way that respects context, and that we don't. And when I say context, I mean that we're in some ways, you just said yourself, with dementia and underprivileged, thinking about adults with underprivileged contexts and their lived experience that they have living in a small rural resource extraction town, and that there's a land story there. There's a land sort of ecological story of those resource extraction. There's probably a socioeconomic story of what meant that those people are now living in those places. There may even be an overlay for a person with dementia that in those same resource extraction towns, they can no longer afford to rent in the place that they're working because of the new industrial camps that are coming in. That's meant that it's impossible to find. And so suddenly these are very practical things that are impacting on what we might see in a clinic, or the story. And when I mentioned earlier that the clinical method is relevant to me, I mean, one of the things that I was aware of as a trainee medical doctor is that I love doing, not just hearing about the presenting complaint, why have you turned up here for today, but I wanted to know about the history of the presenting complaint. And that is something that often when time is rushed, and the doctors in the room will be nodding and saying, oh no, I always do it. But we all know that you don't. We don't often take the time to understand possibly those dimensions of that particular person who's experiencing dementia can't afford to rent the place that they had, for whatever reason, has experienced all sorts of precarity in their lived experience, and that may be really profoundly impacting what's meaning that they're presenting in a room. So what I think is important to remember is that it's just sort of me sort of prodding. Sarah and I it's great. We really enjoy learning from each other in terms of the different ways in which we identify our brains being wired, but actually there's often more overlap than we think. And that I would say that Sarah probably applies a lot of this thinking, but at a cellular level. And so that's really important. So what I was going to say is that one of the things you can do when you're dealing with complexity is to not have to deal with absolutely everything, but to think about a scale above and a scale below. So in the case of your person with dementia, you might be thinking, so there's a person with dementia, and you might be thinking about, okay, so when I go into the human body of that person with dementia, and I get from the body down into the cells, it's really helpful to know a little bit about what's happening in the cells for that person. And likewise, it's helpful for that to go a scale above, to sort of zoom out again and to see, okay, what's happening in their lived experience outside. And that I would argue that any piece of research is going to be strengthened if you go a scale above and below. I think what is interesting for Sarah and I is that her research is sometimes a couple of scales into the cellular, and mine are a couple of scales out into but they are still connected. And it's just a matter of sort of figuring out, and we don't have to have all of those things connected all of the time. Pragmatically as researchers, but even as practitioners, we have to figure out what's manageable, but to not assume that it's just going to be so messy I can't cope, but to actually recognize it's going to strengthen my work if I'm willing to be curious about a scale above and a scale below. And maybe in a room, if you get a team of people together, you might be able to cover a few different scales.
I think that's amazing advice, and I'm going to steal it next time I'm talking to my graduate students, because it's essentially what we ask them to do.
Yeah.
But no, I don't think I've ever put it that eloquently. So thank you. That's right. Yeah. Thank you, Margot.
Well,
Wonderful.
we're probably in the wrap up zone in a few minutes here, but there is a question and from Jaleel, and we're just getting to the bottom of yeah, what a great question. So those of you online are seeing Jaleel's question, but he's asking about this sort of idea of what's embedded within what. And he's asking about social systems and ecosystems, and whether or not we would see them as distinct entities or the latter embedded in the former. And from my point of view, this is where people get into debates, but I do tend to think in many ways, a sort of a simplistic, nested way. So I started with the cells. We were at the cellular level, and as a person that trained as a doctor, I had to do the pathology and look at the cells and look under the microscope, and it's exciting. I mean, I loved it, and I loved anatomy, because anatomy was about the connections between things and the function of how things work. But you put those together in the human body, and then you start this nested process that you're alluding to, Jaleel, of what's embedded in what. And so as a human, in the way that I think about things, I take the human body and I nest it in its kind of most proximal context. And that is usually a home, in the most sort of, you're thinking about the system outside of somebody. I will go home tonight where my partner has been on Zoom calls with people from the Red Cross and elsewhere, and we'll have dinner, and that's an immediate context that I'll be stepping into. But right next to that, if you just take one step outside of the home, then you're in a sort of either a neighborhood or a close proximity, and suddenly you do take this flip from the social into the ecological if you want to, and that's choice. You can just stick with the social. So I can go from me and my house in the Ness Lake neighborhood, can forget the lake, just some body of water. I happen to be an old bag of lake. I'll put that on record, because I'm drinking that lake every day. So I'm just an old bag of lake, really. But I could choose to forget the lake, literally, even though I am it. I could just say, I live in Ness Lake, somewhere near Prince George, the city, somewhere in northern British Columbia, which doesn't exist as a jurisdiction, but we all know what I'm talking about. In British Columbia, in Canada, I could just do all the social embeddedness. Or I can start doing what is the social and ecological in conversation with each other. And that framework where I talked about driving forces of change in socio-ecological systems, it's a mouthful, but it's necessary if we're to put things back together again. So I think here, Jaleel, the point is I would generally go up to social at a certain point, and then I would start talking about social and ecological. That's how I would do it. And I would recognize there are nested components at each level. But at times it may actually be helpful for me to say, I do live by a lake that happens to be in one of the heights of land that drains towards the Nachaca, and that means that I am part of that system flowing into the Fraser and out to all the way out to the Pacific. And that same body of water is carrying on all the way down to the Tari. So it depends, but I think you can do both. And that's where what I really think we need to practice is not the either or thinking about that, which is I think at the heart of your question, Jaleel, which is, do we have to do one thing or the other, or is one more important than the other? And that comes back to that confluence idea of let's acknowledge that even if our area, and I happen to know that Jaleel's an economist and really familiar with the socioeconomic determinants of health, that you may choose to carry on your socioeconomic path, and that's fine, but don't ignore the ecological tributaries. Don't ignore the fact that there are environmental elements that are in conversation with those socioeconomic things, and think about them as a river and just figure out for your work, rather than putting on your blinkers, which is I think what we're taught to do. I think we can deepen and enrich our work if we find in a way that makes sense for us how to have a conversation. And that's the essence here really, is the willingness to be in conversation with both with your own ideas and also with the ideas of others, so that we can get a better sense of the whole. So I think
Wonderful.
we're probably at a
What time are
moment.
we at? Oh, we are at 4 o'clock. So I think we better wrap up.
We should.
But I just want to thank everyone who's in the room here today, everyone online for joining us, and most of all to Margot Parkes for giving this wonderful presentation today. I'm very pleased that, again, I'm just going to reinforce that she has joined Martha as co-lead of the HRI, because I do believe that they are both weavers who will allow us to continue in an integrated way within the HRI, sort of leading us and to bring us all together, which I think is the real goal of the HRI. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you. And thanks everybody for being here.
Thank you. Oh, sure. I can do this. Or use that one. Okay, I can't do it. That was wonderful, Margot. Thank you so much.
I'll have to find where all that is. We'll just keep our fingers crossed that it
Anna,
worked.
did you know you were going to be our tech support? You took the
My
job.
goodness, no. I guess I'm
I
not
should have
very good
warned
at
you.
it.
Rachel knew that.
Mm.
Isn't it hard doing these hybrid sessions? We've really struggled with them in the faculty of medicine as well. Margot, that was wonderful. And Darlene,
I knew that she had to
you
go.
do should
Yeah,
go. Okay,
yeah.
she just wanted me to say goodbye.
I just want to escape, but it's not quite letting me end show. Sorry.
Oh.
All right, we'll call that done.